I learned a very bitter truth. My wife, after many years of living together, is cheating on me with some jerk. It hurt me a lot. I have all the evidence of her infidelity on my hands, but I decided to teach her a lesson in a slightly different way. I wanted justice. It was Wednesday, October 22nd. I stood in the shower, letting the hot water pour over my head. I had been doing this a lot lately, taking longer showers, spending time just standing or leaning against the wall as the hot water streamed over my body. I often found myself crying. For some reason, the tears tended to come while I was in the shower. In fact, the shower was really the only private place I could cry, aside from driving the car, which wasn't very practical. Over the past few weeks, my showers had grown longer, with my bouts of tears sometimes adding an extra 10 minutes to my routine. I wondered if Liz had noticed how long my showers were taking. Then again, she didn't seem to be noticing much about me lately. I was the one who had been noticing things she didn't seem to realize I was aware of. But this morning I wasn't crying. This morning I was going to see Richard Groner. Today, things were going to start changing dramatically, though I wasn't entirely sure that what was to come would be any less painful than what had already happened. As I dried off in the quiet house, Carly and Christina were already at school and Liz had left for work. I reflected on my conversation with Ernie Matazzolo 2 days earlier. Ernie's office was unimpressive, located in a rundown part of Cincinnati far from the upscale department stores. However, he came highly recommended as someone who knew his business. "All right, Mr. H," he said as we sat down at the table in his tiny office. "I did exactly what you asked, although I've never had a client request this before." I nodded, and he continued. "I didn't do any video because you said you didn't want any. I recorded audio from 3 of their encounters, put it on this CD for you, and sealed it up just as you requested. Are you sure you don't want to listen to it?" I shook my head. "As I told you, Ernie, if there's any chance for Liz and me, I can't have those sounds in my head. Just summarize it for me, all right?" "Well, there's nothing special going on. It's just it's just intimacy. They don't talk much, and certainly nothing romantic like 'if only we could be together,' or 'when I get a divorce,' or anything like that." "Do they talk about me at all?" I asked. "Or Groner's wife?" He thought for a moment. "Groner never mentions his wife. A couple of times he brought up your name like, 'I bet your husband won't be able to make you have fun that way.' But she always tells him to stop. She never lets him put you down or anything, and she doesn't talk about you herself." "What are they talking about?" "In the beginning, it's mostly just bed topics." I must have flinched because Ernie was silent for a moment, looking at me. "Are you okay, Mr. H?" "Yes," I said. "Please continue." "In general, that's the way it is. Then at the end, when they shower and get dressed, they just discuss when they can meet again." "Does Liz love him?" "Not that I've heard," Ernie said. "There are probably novels like this, but most of them are more like this one. 2 people meet to engage in intimacy." "I'm sorry I put it that way, Mr. H. They seem to be very attracted to each other, but nothing more." "Are they doing anything special? In bed?" "I don't think so. I haven't heard anything about anything interesting." We sat in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't as bad as I feared. It was unspeakable. It was crushing, but also no worse than I imagined. Actually, it wasn't that bad. She didn't love him. They weren't planning on running away together. She was just making love to him. Just an affair. An ordinary affair with a man who wasn't her husband. With a man who wasn't me. "Okay, Ernie," I finally said. "Thanks for everything. How much do I owe you?" Without hesitation, I wrote him a check for almost $8,000, and he pulled out 3 envelopes made of thick paper. "As you asked, the first one shows about a dozen shots of the 2 of them entering and exiting one of the motels they used. The ones that were made, about 4 dozen or so, are in this big envelope. all sealed with duct tape, just like you wanted. I hid the negatives along with a copy of the audio disc. And in this third envelope, as you requested, there is one of the photographs. Only one, right? And do they both have clear faces? Yes, he said. Thanks, Ernie, I repeated and got up to leave. Wait, I said. I almost forgot. What have you learned about Groner? Ernie smiled tightly. A womanizer, as you suspected. Betsy, my assistant that I told you about, she talked to 5-6 people in his firm, and apparently he is the main skirt hunter in the whole company. Although he seems to be somewhat cautious about this matter. It seems that his wife is an heiress, her fortune is about $80 million, and he does not want to get out of the rut. On the drive to Groner's office, I reflected on the past few months. The first indication of trouble I noticed was at the beginning of August, about 3 months ago. We had endured an exhausting, difficult, and frightening year. Carly had been diagnosed with leukemia just before Halloween the previous year, and we had been thrust into a nightmare of doctors, hospitals, chemotherapy, and sleepless nights filled with worry. Our little girl was only 8, and she faced the pain, fear, and upheaval with incredible courage and patience. Christina, 2 years younger, was her constant companion and support. Needless to say, Liz and I set everything else in our lives aside to care for Carly, doing just the bare minimum at work, and abandoning all thoughts of our social life or our own relationship. By last summer, thankfully, Carly was in remission. She was regaining her strength and her hair was growing back, with a 90% chance that she was completely cured. We received the good news in mid-June and celebrated with a week at Disney World. Overwhelmed with exhaustion and relief, Liz and I let the kids do whatever they wanted, ride all the rides, eat all the food, and stay up as late as they could. It was a memory I would always cherish. However, the ordeal took a toll on Liz's and my relationship. As things started to return to normal, I dove back into my work as an economic analyst. I worked in the Cincinnati office of a major New York bank. My colleagues had covered for me for months, and I was anxious to get back up to speed and start contributing again. Liz's job was less demanding. She was the Assistant Director of Human Resources at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. But she too was eager to catch up, and we were both exhausted from months of worry and fear. In hindsight, I realized that neither of us had been paying enough attention to our marriage. The first time I heard of Richard Groner was quite innocuous. In early July, Liz had to give a deposition in a lawsuit against the medical center, and Groner was the center's attorney. That evening, Liz recounted the experience over dinner, casually mentioning that Groner was impressive, tall, very handsome, and extremely effective in the legal wrangling that surrounded her testimony. Over the next couple of weeks, Liz mentioned 2 more meetings with Groner, ostensibly to review details of her testimony, and then nothing. She stopped mentioning him, and I assumed their interactions were over. This assumption was far from accurate. Liz continued seeing him, but as their meetings transitioned from legal discussions to something else, she simply stopped telling me about them. We took our usual 2-week vacation in August at a cabin on Lake Michigan. It was always a relaxed and romantic time for us. The girls would play all day, and after they were asleep, Liz and I would catch up on the lovemaking we hadn't had time for during our busy year. However, this vacation was different. Noticeably so, though it was hard to pinpoint exactly how. It wasn't that we made love less or that Liz seemed less interested, at least not on the surface. She was still affectionate and certainly not reluctant, but she was less present, both when we made love and at other times. She seemed distracted, lost in her own world in a way that concerned me. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew something was off. When I asked her about it a few times, she would bring her attention back to me and say it was nothing. I guess I'm just still recovering from the past year, honey. Or something like that. I was frustrated. I missed my wife, and I could tell she wasn't fully present with me. Her explanation seemed convincing, though. Both of us were emotionally drained after Carly's battle with cancer, and I thought things would eventually return to normal. However, by mid-September, things had gotten worse instead of better. Liz seemed constantly strained and uneasy around me. I occasionally caught her with a haunted look on her face, staring blankly out the window when she didn't know I was watching. She was more forgetful than usual, sometimes not remembering to be home in time to cook dinner on her scheduled days, or going out to run errands on a Saturday and returning without the dry cleaning she intended to pick up. By then, I was seriously worried. I spent a lot of time thinking about her behavior and what it could mean. The possibility of an affair crossed my mind, though it seemed crazy. Our bedtime didn't decrease. We still managed to have intimacy a couple of times a week, which was our average since the girls were born. On a few evenings, Liz was more enthusiastic than usual, even a little wild and demanding. I loved those nights at the time, but in hindsight, they only added to my concern. Or guilty. What was going on? I definitely asked her from time to time if something was bothering her, if there was a crisis at work, if she felt okay physically, if I had done something to upset her. But her constant response was always a tight, "Oh no, honey, I'm fine, really, maybe just a little tired." This was said in an overly casual way, followed by a hug and kiss that were meant to reassure me but actually had the opposite effect. On September 26th, I'll never forget the date because it was Christina's birthday, and we had 10 of her friends over for a party. I happened to ask Liz about the hospital lawsuit and if she was still in touch with Richard Groner. "Who?" she replied, suddenly looking a little pale. I stared at her in disbelief and she said, "Oh, of course. That lawyer who handled my deposition for the lawsuit last summer. How silly of me. No, I haven't spoken to him in a couple of months, I guess. We met a couple of times after the deposition, but I think he must be all done with me." She turned back to the dishes and we both stayed silent for a moment. Then she started asking me about our gutters and if I had called our yard guy yet about cleaning them out. It was an unexpectedly unconvincing change of subject, and it shook me up quite a bit. But I didn't push it. Her pretending to forget who Groner was so unsettling that I had to think about how to proceed. That night while she slept, I found her purse and carefully searched through it. I didn't discover anything incriminating, but there was one puzzling aspect. The call log on her cell phone revealed nothing out of the ordinary. I specifically checked for Groner's office number, but it was nowhere to be found. In her planner, there was a note about a deposition on July 8th, along with 2 other entries regarding meetings with Groner. After that, there was no further mention of him. However, I noticed 3 instances, 2 in August and 1 in early September, where entries had been meticulously erased, making it impossible to decipher what had been written. Since then, everything seemed normal. I remained awake until nearly 4 a.m. that night, consumed by worry and unable to sleep. The following morning, I sought advice from a friend and decided to consult Ernie Matazzolo. On October 3rd, he called me and got straight to the point. She's having an affair with a guy named Groner who happens to be a lawyer. While it wasn't unexpected, it still devastated me. About an hour later, I called him back and instructed him to continue investigating. "I want you to record a few of their meetings, just audio, no video, and take some photos. Capture them entering and leaving the motel or wherever they meet, and, if possible, get some shots of the actual act." "I can handle it," he replied curtly, and we discussed the logistics and his fee. Richard Groner occupied a high-rise office on the 16th floor downtown. His youthful, voluptuous blonde secretary gleefully informed me that without an appointment, he was too occupied this morning to entertain me. I offered a smile, then retrieved a business card from my wallet. On its reverse side, I scribbled, "En route to present some photos to your wife. Expect a 5-minute wait." Handing the card to Ms. Blonde, I requested, "Kindly pass this along to him. I'll remain here." In less than 2 minutes, she returned to me, her attempt to conceal her irritation falling short. "Mr. Groner is ready to see you now," she announced. Uncertain of his reaction, Initially, he greeted me with casual warmth. Stepping out from his desk, he wore a broad smile and extended a hearty handshake. "Mr. Hendricks, how do you do? Please, come in and take a seat." Though I hadn't met him previously, he fit Liz's description from months ago. Standing around 6'2", he was strikingly handsome in his mid-30s, akin to Liz and myself. His rugged, well-tanned features and piercing blue eyes held a certain allure. It wasn't difficult to fathom why women might be drawn to him, though it provided little solace in that moment. I sat quietly, anticipating signs of nervousness from him. He managed to conceal it well, maintaining his smile, devoid of any fidgeting or anxious gestures. However, after about 30 seconds, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "Well, Mr. Hendricks, how can I assist you?" "Mr. Groner," I said softly, "my wife is Liz Hendricks, and currently I hold your fate in my hands. How tightly I grip it is entirely your choice." He remained silent, but this time his fingers betrayed him with a slight tremble. He responded as composedly as possible. "I'm afraid I don't comprehend." "You've been involved with Liz," I continued in the same hushed tone. "I possess evidence, and I'm fairly certain that this evidence could jeopardize your prestigious position, your livelihood, and your access to your wife's trust fund." He glanced nervously at the manila envelopes in my possession, but attempted to feign confidence. "I'm sorry. I have no idea what you're referring to." This was proving to be more enjoyable than I had anticipated. After a moment of silence, I wordlessly passed him the first envelope. When he unfolded it and glanced at the images, a wave of relief washed over him, and color flooded back into his face. Grinning widely, he remarked, "But these merely capture Liz and me entering and leaving a meeting room." "A motel," I interjected. "The Chesterton Motor Court on Route 52 in Riverview Heights. It's rather frugal of you not to opt for something more upscale, wouldn't you agree?" He rose, evidently hoping to dismiss me. "These photographs hardly constitute evidence, Mr. Hendricks. I must insist." Without standing, I handed him another envelope. As he opened it, he extracted a lone photograph and studied it intently for a moment. Then he returned it to the envelope, sank back into his chair, and ran a hand through his hair. His expression turned grim. "I have several dozen similar ones," I stated, "stored in various secure locations." We lapsed into silence. I observed him as he absent-mindedly stared at the wall behind me, processing his thoughts. "What are you after?" he eventually inquired. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "And why?" He chuckled, devoid of amusement. "The why is simple. Your wife is attractive, man, in case you haven't noticed. I saw her and desired her. Have you ever seen my wife?" I shook my head, prompting him to continue. "She must weigh 250 pounds, and she perspires. Well, you get the idea. Liz is stunning, much more my type." "For how long?" I pressed. "About a month. It took me ages to make progress with her, if you want the truth. I pursued her all summer, gently, subtly, maintaining professionalism initially. She resisted vigorously, kept professing her love for you, the usual spiel. They all say that, you know, but usually they give in much sooner than she did. It was probably not until nearly the end of September that she—" "Enough," I interjected. You've answered my question." Despite his situation, he couldn't conceal a self-satisfied smirk entirely. It seemed to amuse him, sitting across from the deceived husband. I pondered if this was part of his enjoyment, not only the intimacy but also outsmarting clueless individuals like myself. "Fine. Call her right now and end it. It's been enjoyable, she's wonderful, etc., but it's time to move forward. I assume you've done this before." He studied me. "And what comes next?" "I leave. And if you're fortunate, I won't show these photos to the managing partner of your law firm or to your wife. Come on, if I make the call, you have to hand over the photos." I smirked coldly. "No chance, Rich. You only have two choices here. Either you end things with Liz, and there's a possibility your life won't implode. Or you don't. And the blissful life of Richard Groner will be over in a matter of hours." He sat there, visibly upset and furious. Then he reached for the phone. "I'd like to speak with Ms. Hendricks, please." "This is Richard Groner calling from Parker and Medoff." He swiveled in his chair, facing away from me as he awaited Liz's answer. "Hey, darling, it's me. Yeah, I understand." He chuckled softly. "Me too. I guess we were both quite something." "Listen, No, I can't. No, it's not that. Just hear me out, Liz, okay? This has been amazing and you are so incredibly beautiful, but, we knew there would come a time and here it is." No, don't say that. It's not about you, darling, it's just that, well, these things take on a life of their own, And, like that song says, our love was too hot not to cool down. Now, don't be like that. We both knew it wouldn't. Listen, Liz, please don't cry, okay? We both knew this was bound to happen eventually. Of course there's no one else. What kind of sleazy jerk do you... Wait a minute, it took two of us. I didn't force you into bed that first time. Listen, darling, there's no need to shout, we both... After a pause, he placed the receiver back on its base. "She hung up on me," he sighed. His expression turned grave, devoid of any previous arrogance. "How much longer would it have continued, Acquire? Mon écrire. I presume this isn't the first occurrence for you. Maybe a few more months, 2 or 3 perhaps, she was... Enough, I don't want to hear any more." We exchanged a silent gaze. I sensed his eagerness to dismiss me. Yet he remained at my mercy, unwilling to risk ejecting me outright. "Understand this clearly. You are forbidden from contacting Liz in any way. No calls, emails, letters, visits. Nothing. Is that understood?" He nodded cautiously, scrutinizing me. "If she reaches out to you, discard her messages. If she contacts you electronically, delete the correspondence. If she calls, ignore her. If she shows up, refuse to see her." He nodded again. "This is permanent, Richard. I'm dead serious." "And the photos?" he inquired. "You'll have to rely on my goodwill," I replied, rising from my seat. He stood as well. Just as I began to walk away, I added, "Oh, one more thing." I turned back and delivered a forceful blow to his groin with my fist. He groaned and collapsed behind his desk. I circled around and observed him, curled up in pain, his face twisted. I waited a few minutes until the agony seemed to subside and his breathing steadied. Then I delivered another kick to his groin before turning and exiting the office. Moving past Richard Groner. It was Liz's turn to prepare dinner, and as I entered the kitchen, she was bustling around, arranging the table and attending to 3 pots on the stove. I greeted her with the customary hug and asked, "Hey, how's everything?" She replied, "Oh, fine. It's been a bit of a long day. The girls are watching cartoons or something dreadful. Do you want a glass of wine?" Her expression seemed weary, tinged with sadness. There was a hint of redness in her eyes, suggesting she had been crying, though she had made an effort to wash her face and touch up her makeup. If I hadn't been paying close attention, I might not have noticed. Dinner proceeded as usual, remarkably so, considering the challenges of my day and undoubtedly hers as well. The girls chatted away as they always did, which helped to maintain a sense of normalcy, discussing their disliked teachers, lamenting how the boys monopolized the playground at recess, and eagerly anticipating their friend's upcoming birthday party. Being around my daughters made it impossible to feel unhappy. Even during the past dreadful month when it seemed like my whole world was crumbling, I couldn't help but smile, laugh, and embrace them. Thank goodness Carly had recovered from her illness. Despite everything, I felt fortunate. Liz and I assisted them with their baths, read them bedtime stories, tucked them into bed, and listened to their excited chatter about Halloween costumes for the following week. It was all part of the routine. After they had fallen asleep, Liz seemed restless and unsure of what to do with herself. I don't think she realized how closely I was observing her, but she couldn't seem to settle down. She flicked on the TV, flipped through channels, then turned it off again. She picked up her book but quickly abandoned it after a few pages. From upstairs, I could hear her moving around the kitchen, tidying up and emptying the dishwasher. When she returned upstairs, I asked, "Are you okay, honey?" I wasn't trying to catch her off guard. In fact, I had no intention of revealing what I knew about her and Richard Groner, or what I had done earlier that day. But if I had ignored her restlessness, it might have seemed strange to her. "It's nothing, just some work-related annoyances," she replied, heading into the bathroom with her nightgown. "I guess I'm just a bit preoccupied." I decided to let it go. We turned off the lights. She gave me a quick kiss, then turned away from me. I wondered which of us would struggle more to fall asleep that night. It turned out to be me. While it felt like hours before I could finally drift off, I soon heard her steady breathing beside me. In the following days and weeks, I kept a close eye on Liz. My desire was clear. I wanted her to return to me. I wished for her to recognize what we once had, with me and the girls, to understand the grave error she had made, and to appreciate the fortune of our marriage surviving. I longed for her to love me again, as deeply as she did before Groner, before Carly's leukemia, before our world began to crumble. However, I couldn't predict the outcome. Despite my vigilant observation, I noticed no immediate change in Liz. She remained lost in thought, often staring blankly out of the window. Occasionally, the same aura of discontent surrounded her, though she brushed it off whenever I inquired. We were close several times during that first week. The only noticeable change was that Liz kept her eyes tightly closed. She wasn't smiling at me as usual. I wondered if she was afraid that her expression might betray something, or if, closing her eyes, she could imagine that I was Richard Groner. 9 days after my visit to Groner, Halloween came, and the girls were bursting with excitement. They barely had time to have dinner when they dragged me to distribute sweets. As usual, I accompanied them, while Liz stayed at home to distribute candy to other candy lovers. Due to the festive fuss and excitement around sweets, the girls did not sleep until almost 11 p.m. Fortunately, it was the weekend. Liz and I exchanged smiles when we finally put them to bed. While I was reading in bed, she joined me. As I switched off the light, she whispered, "Alan, I'm not in the mood for intimacy tonight, but can we just cuddle?" "Of course," I replied, and she nestled close to me, resting her head on my shoulder. We lay there quietly, content. I thought she might drift off to sleep like that, but after a few minutes she lifted her head and said softly, "Alan, I'm so sorry." "For what?" I asked, somewhat surprised. "I don't know. For everything. For being distant lately, especially after Carly's leukemia ordeal and our exhaustion last summer. I haven't been fully present for you, and I apologize." I remained silent, absorbing her apology, knowing there was more left unsaid. I understood Liz, and I believed her sincerity. But I also knew the true reason for her recent distance, something she wasn't acknowledging: her affair with Groner. "Thank you, Liz," I finally said. "I've missed you, you know. I've wondered if I was to blame." No, she interjected. "You've been amazing, patient, kind, supportive." She drew me closer. "You deserve better, darling, and I'm going to make it right." It felt like a test. In truth, every moment with Liz felt like a test. Would I succumb to anger, humiliation, and pain, or would I stick to the path I had chosen? I knew I had to, as it was the only alternative to the end of our marriage. It was incredibly difficult, but I held on. "That sounds wonderful," I said, reaching for a gentle kiss in the darkness. I didn't dare say more. I didn't trust myself to find the right words. The next night we were close. It was pleasant, but at the same time strangely hesitant, unlike what it had been in recent months. Liz seemed insecure, eager to please me, but at the same time, a little afraid. It seemed that we didn't know each other so well anymore, and were afraid of making mistakes. However, as the day progressed, Liz felt more at ease with me. The humor that has always been the cornerstone of our relationship, the jokes, playful banter that defined our bond from the first days of dating, began to manifest itself again. Then, 2 weeks after Halloween, we had the best intimacy we've probably had in the last 2 years. In the months that followed, various aspects of our relationship seemed to recover at different speeds. At first, our joint parenting role was quickly restored, since there was not much to fix. Even at the peak of her romance, when Liz seemed detached and preoccupied with another man, she remained completely preoccupied with the children, perhaps even more, as if compensating for her actions. This was probably followed by our closeness. Despite the affair, the frequency of our contacts did not decrease significantly, probably because Liz tried to maintain them. However, her enthusiasm and engagement have noticeably decreased. It was obvious to me that she was emotionally detached during our meetings. It didn't feel like a connection that I appreciated. Instead, it felt more like a formal intimacy. After Halloween, her genuine interest in intimacy with me began to flare up with renewed vigor. Initially, it may have been partly motivated by a desire to make it up to me, but gradually it became evident that Liz was once again fully engaged in our lovemaking, just as she had been before her affair. She took more initiative, perhaps consciously trying to recreate some of the passionate encounters we had in the early, pre-children days. However, it wasn't merely a performance to please me. She was actively involved and passionate, and her excitement was genuine, not feigned. From November to February, we engaged in intimacy 3 or even 4 times a week, until everything returned to our usual routine, twice a week. But thankfully, it was genuine lovemaking. Liz was fully present in bed with me, giving herself to me as completely as ever. I wasn't certain we would ever regain that level of intimacy, but we did. Interestingly, it took longer to fully restore our daily intimacy as husband and wife. This was probably more about my own emotions, my anger, hurt, and suspicion, than about Liz. With each passing day of improvement, Liz grew more confident that her affair with Groner was truly in the past and that our marriage would endure. Consequently, she became more comfortable being fully my wife, again, just as she was before. Even after we seemed to be back to normal, maybe about 6 months after her affair ended, I was still struggling with my rage, shame, and pain almost daily. Not a day went by that I didn't have the thought of hurting her. How could she give herself to this despicable man repeatedly for several weeks? How could she share intimacy with him and then come home to me with a smile, a kiss, pretending to be the loving wife she once was? How could she constantly cheat? How could she so callously disregard our marriage vows? The questions sounded endless. But I made a decision. I knew what I wanted and believed that the path I had chosen was the best way to achieve it. So I endured the pain, shed tears alone, and continued to live my life. I want to be honest with Liz. Everything is fine. Gradually it happened. I found my loving wife long before I began to believe that she had really returned, but eventually my emotions came into line with reality. I knew that she loved me, wanted to be with me, and sincerely desired me. About 8 months after meeting Groner, we became the happy, loving couple we once were, before Carly's illness, before Liz's affair. And maybe about 2 years after that, I woke up one morning and realized that I was satisfied, that I felt safe in my marriage again. It took a long time, and it wasn't easy. But it seems that I have achieved what I was aiming for. Ruining Richard Groner. On a Sunday in April, as I lazily flipped through the style section of the Cincinnati Enquirer, I stumbled upon it. Local lawyer to be named Man of the Year. Lo and behold, it featured none other than Richard Groner. With Liz occupied outside, tending to the garden with the girls, I seized the opportunity to peruse the article. The Ladies' Auxiliary of the J.C.'s Foundation planned to bestow Groner with this honor for his extensive philanthropic endeavors in the Cincinnati community. A fundraising dinner, priced at $250 per person, was scheduled for the end of May in his honor, with proceeds earmarked for the local Boys and Girls Club, a cause evidently close to Groner's heart. I hadn't given much thought to that particular individual in quite some time, but my visceral reaction to the article made it abundantly clear. I wasn't finished with him. I discreetly disposed of the style section, ensuring Liz wouldn't stumble upon it, and resolved to contact Ernie Matazzolo. "I'm perplexed, Mr. H," he remarked. "You've already got plenty of photos of that guy with your wife. Why throw away your money on more?" "Because, Ernie, I intend to expose this man once and for all. I want to send photographs and recordings to his wife, perhaps even to his law firm. Let there be a grand scandal, if fortune favors, but I refuse to have my wife implicated in the midst of it." He sighed. "Well, Mr. H, I'm glad to take your money, but I do believe you're acting irrationally." He did it in less than 3 weeks. He took some wonderful pictures of Groner with Mrs. Wallace, Athena Wallace, the attractive wife of City Councilman Bernard Wallace, who was in her 40s. Even more impressive was that they first met when the fringe firm represented the Wallaces in a commercial real estate dispute, which made Groner's actions a violation of legal ethics. I've never felt more satisfied in my life after spending $6,000. I asked Ernie to send the photos and audio recordings to Mrs. Grover, Mr. Wallace, managing partner of the Groner law firm, and the Cincinnati Enquirer. The results exceeded all my expectations. Cincinnati Enquirer, May 5th, cancellation of charitable fundraiser. Without explanation, the Ladies' Auxiliary decided to cancel Groner's dinner event. Cincinnati Enquirer, May 11th. Lawsuit against prominent Cincinnati firm. Cincinnati City Councilman Mr. Bernard Wallace initiated legal action against Parker and Medoff for alleged misconduct. No specifics were provided and the firm declined to comment. Cincinnati Enquirer, August 18th. City Councilman Wallace initiates divorce, involvement of local lawyer alleged. Bernard Wallace filed for divorce, and a local lawyer was implicated as his wife's purported lover. Cincinnati Enquirer, September 10th. Groner terminated from firm. Richard Groner was fired by Parker and Medoff for unspecified improper behavior. Groner could not be reached for a response. Cincinnati Enquirer, November 11th. Settlement in councilman's lawsuit against law firm. Parker and Medoff reached a financial agreement with Bernard Wallace over his legal action. Neither party disclosed details, but sources suggested Wallace received over $2.4 million. Cincinnati Enquirer, December 2nd. City Council restricts firm contracts. A bill, introduced by Councilman Bernard Wallace, banned Parker and Medoff from city contracts for 5 years due to Groner's alleged misconduct. Cincinnati Enquirer, December 29th. Lawyer to depart area amid Parker and Medoff controversy. Richard Groner, facing potential disbarment, planned to relocate to California. The article noted his recent divorce from Elizabeth Groner, a descendant of the Vanderbilt family. I resisted the urge to leave the newspapers out on the kitchen table with pages folded to specific articles. Liz didn't regularly read the paper, but that wasn't the point. My intention wasn't to flaunt Liz's affair. It was to take down the person who had seduced her. I assume she must have come across something about him, given some articles were on the front page, but we never discussed it. Once the last article passed, there was no further mention of Richard Groner. I had exacted my revenge, and it felt satisfying. Returning to Richard Groner. Life was wonderful and remained so until the girls reached the ages of 17 and 15. Carly's leukemia hadn't resurfaced, and both girls were in good health, excelling in sports as stars of their soccer and basketball teams. They maintained good grades, kept us informed about their whereabouts, and overall were fantastic kids. Liz and I frequently expressed gratitude for how fortunate we were. In April, a man named Tom K. Bernardo joined the staff at the medical center, and for a few weeks Liz kept mentioning him to me. She jokingly remarked, "He seems to think he's irresistible to women. He's already made advances towards Marcia. Asked Alexa out on a date 3 times and flirted with all the secretaries in my office." "What's his personality like?" I inquired, feeling a bit uneasy immediately. My complete trust in Liz had been shattered long ago, and it wasn't going to be restored. He's good-looking enough, I suppose, handsome in a rugged way with a strong jawline and dark eyes. But honestly, he's so full of himself and aggressive. He behaves as if he expects women to swoon over him at a mere glance. Several of the senior staff members are already annoyed with him. Over the next month or so, I occasionally caught wind of stories involving Tom K. Bernardo. "He insists on being called Tom K. Can you believe it?" my wife remarked. It appeared that his confrontational behavior towards female colleagues was escalating from a mere joke to a growing nuisance. Gradually, Liz ceased mentioning Bernardo altogether. When I inquired about him once, she nonchalantly waved it off, mentioning they no longer shared the same compensation working group. Pressed further about his conduct towards female staff, she vaguely remarked, "Not that I've heard." Seeing her eagerness to move on, I dropped the topic, though I couldn't shake off my concerns. The adage, "once bitten, twice shy," certainly resonated with me. I observed Liz closely, noticing a similar distracted demeanor reminiscent of her interactions with Richard Groner during his pursuit. It was evident she had something weighing on her mind, so much so that even our daughters noticed her absent-mindedness at dinner, jokingly suggesting Alzheimer's or the need for assisted living. Carly and Christina shared a laugh while Liz managed to muster a strained smile. Yet I sensed that something was amiss, and it wasn't Alzheimer's. In the following weeks, Liz grew somewhat distant from me, though her affection didn't diminish. We continued to make love regularly, and sometimes she appeared just as passionate as before. She remained interested in my work, in the activities of our daughters, and in our family life in general, much like always. However, there were occasional late-night meetings that kept her out until 8 p.m. Sometimes she would take private phone calls in the den with the door closed. Once or twice, these calls were from female colleagues. I knew because I answered the phone, but I had no clue about the identities of the other callers. After one of her evening meetings, she entered the house with a distracted, worried expression. Rising to embrace her, I was met with her request, "Let me shower first, okay, Alan? I'm tired and feeling grubby." Disregarding her plea, I enveloped her in my arms, holding her close and inhaling the scent of her hair. She hadn't showered since morning, evident by her aroma, which, thankfully, didn't hint at any illicit encounters. Releasing her, she made her way to the bedroom. Later, as we sat together in the kitchen while she prepared a sandwich, I broached the subject. "Listen, Liz, is there something troubling you? You've seemed distant lately, and I miss the real you. Do we need to have a conversation?" She looked at me with alarm, responding, "No, honey, really. It's just that work has been unusually demanding lately. I could do without these late meetings, but when the director or the assistant director insists, there's little I can do." She flashed me a smile, gauging my reaction, and I feigned reassurance. However, after she retired to bed that night, I remained in the living room until past 2 a.m., contemplating. Was it time to reach out to Ernie Matazzolo once more? One thing was certain in my mind. If Liz was being unfaithful again, our marriage was irreparably damaged. With that unsettling thought, I finally retired to bed. 4 days later, everything happened in a way I never expected. On Monday morning, as Liz was leaving the house after breakfast, she casually remarked, "Oh, honey, it turns out I have another terrible meeting tonight. I can't be back until 9, so is it okay if you and the kids take care of yourselves?" Without waiting for my reply, she blew me a kiss and headed for her car in the garage. Something inside me snapped, and I hurried after her. When she got into her minibus, I slid into the passenger seat and stared at her, taking her by surprise. "No, it's not okay. There's something you're not telling me, and I want to know what it is." "Alan," she replied with sarcasm in her voice, "it's just a late meeting with senior staff. I don't understand why you're so upset. Maybe you haven't noticed how many late-night meetings you've had lately, or how detached you've been with me and the kids. You're not being honest with me, Liz." Her anger was palpable. "For God's sake, Alan, have I ever given you a reason not to trust me?" At that moment, everything changed. Her question echoed in my head, and all my years of self-control evaporated in a fit of rage. "When you slept with Richard Groner," I screamed, "and if you're doing the same thing to this guy, Bernardo, then consider our marriage over." Seething with anger, I exited the car and forcefully shut the door behind me. Glancing back through the window, I caught sight of Liz's expression, pale, shocked, and motionless, her mouth ajar in disbelief. She remained silent as I stormed back into the house. Inside the kitchen, I paced furiously, my rage coursing through me, fueled by a sense of justified anger. How dare she, lying and betraying me once more? It took over 20 minutes before I could even begin to calm down and comprehend the gravity of my actions. I had divulged the secret that had been the foundation of Liz and my reconciliation, undoing all the effort and restraint I had exerted to salvage our marriage from the wreckage of her affair with Groner. Dragging myself to work with little enthusiasm, I found it difficult to focus throughout the day, my mind consumed by the bleak prospects ahead. Would I lose everything now, after so much time had passed? Would Carly and Christina have to endure the pain of divorce? Part of me was simply despondent, for my daughters, for myself, and even, to some extent, for Liz. But predominantly, as the day progressed, my fury intensified. That damned woman. I had exercised unimaginable self-control, poured every ounce of effort into salvaging our marriage, and yet she had betrayed me again. In the late afternoon, I came to the realization that I couldn't bear to return home. Facing her was out of the question. I couldn't bring myself to look at her or engage in civil conversation. I phoned Christina, informing her that I'd be out late and they should proceed with dinner without me. I drove to the Hyatt, checked into a room, ordered a sandwich and a beer via room service, and sat despondently watching a series of mindless movies until nearly midnight. Upon returning home, I quietly packed a suitcase with my essentials and a few days' worth of clothes, then headed back to the hotel. Luckily, Liz was a deep sleeper and didn't stir as I moved silently around the darkened bedroom. It took all my restraint not to wake her and vent my frustration. The following day at work was even more difficult. As each hour passed, my anger grew, making it increasingly challenging to focus. I turned off my cell phone and redirected my office line to voicemail. By 4 p.m., I had 7 messages. 3 of them were from Liz, and I forced myself to listen to the first. In a shaky voice, she pleaded, "Honey, are you okay? I'm so sorry about Richard. I never realized you knew about that. But I promise there's nothing going on with Tom Bernardo, or anyone else. Please, you have to believe me. Honey, please come home so we can talk. I'm so," a heavy sob, "I'm so sorry, so very sorry. Please, please come home." The other 2 messages followed the same pattern. I muttered curses as I erased them. She was expressing her deep regret, as if it made any difference to me. It was my turn to cook dinner that night, and I realized I couldn't leave the girls without a meal. So I grabbed a couple of pizzas and a large Greek salad from Giovanni's and brought them home around 5:30, knowing Liz wouldn't be there yet. I quickly ate with the girls, shared some jokes, then fabricated an excuse about needing to return to work and left the house. Another evening of frustration and solitude awaited me at the Hyatt. The following day marked my 3rd day away, and by the day's end there were 5 more messages from Liz, all filled with tears and apologies, all insisting she wasn't involved with Bernardo. I simply didn't want to engage with her. I had no desire to hear her out, see her face, or even entertain the thought of her. So I sent her a text message saying, "Oh, really, and I'm supposed to believe you? Why, exactly?" Then I switched off my phone and headed back to the Hyatt. This time I didn't even bother to call the girls. Let Liz explain why Daddy wasn't returning home. By Thursday, the 4th day of my absence, it was clear that something needed to change. Exhausted and emotionally drained, I longed for my daughters, but the idea of facing Liz filled me with rage. I pondered the idea of picking up the girls and taking them out for dinner without Liz. At about 2:30 p.m., a middle-aged man whom I vaguely recognized entered my office. "Mr. Hendricks," he said, "I'm Peter Danielson, a lawyer from the medical center. We've met once or twice before." I vaguely remembered him from several meetings with Liz's colleagues, so I motioned for him to sit down. "Can I close the door?" he asked, and I nodded, watching as he closed it before returning to his seat. "I understand that I don't have any legal authority to do this," he began, "but I'm going to ask you to keep our conversation a secret. I hope that after we talk, you will understand why I am making this request. Your wife asked me to talk to you," he continued, and when I started to answer, he raised his hand to stop me. "There was a delicate situation involving Tom C. Bernardo at the medical center," he explained, "and she suggested that you might have misunderstood her. If you don't mind, I'll tell you the details, although I respectfully ask you to keep it a secret." The information he shared was amazing. Several women at the hospital accused Bernardo of harassment, with one incident involving beatings. Danielson assisted these women, 2 of whom reported to Liz, in bringing the case against Bernardo. It turned out that Bernardo quit his previous job because of similar accusations. The difficulty was that Bernardo was the nephew of the junior senator from Indiana, and everyone was worried about a possible negative reaction from his uncle if the situation was not handled delicately. Therefore, Peter and his legal team acted carefully and quietly, collecting affidavits and evidence before involving the police. This explained Liz's late nights and her recent absent-minded behavior. After Danielson finished recounting his story, I sat in silence for a moment. Initially, I felt relieved and joyful. Thank goodness she wasn't cheating on me again. Perhaps we could genuinely resolve our issues. However, my joy was short-lived. Why couldn't she have shared this story with me, even just a fragment of it? Didn't she trust me to keep it confidential? Moreover, how could I be sure Danielson wasn't deceiving me? He and Liz were colleagues. Well acquainted, was he possibly fabricating this tale to assist her? "Why didn't Liz disclose this to me?" I queried him. "Or at least part of it." He offered a half-hearted apology. "That was by my request, Mr. Hendricks. We were all a bit, well, paranoid, to be frank, so I insisted on keeping this under wraps, even from spouses, until it became public." "And when will that be?" I asked cynically. "Next Monday," he replied earnestly. "We finally arranged everything, and the arrest will likely occur by Monday afternoon." There wasn't much more to discuss. After some thought, I assured him of my willingness to maintain confidentiality. "Thank you," he said, standing up from his seat. "And I genuinely apologize if this situation has caused any issues between you and your wife. She's been quite distressed about it. Several of the victims are her close friends. We'll all be relieved when the authorities take over and Bernardo is removed from the workplace." That evening, upon entering through the front door, I found Liz standing in the foyer, adorned with an apron and displaying evident nervousness. Dark circles underscored her eyes, and tension visibly gripped her entire frame. I likely mirrored her state. "Hi, Alan," she greeted, moving towards me for a hug. However, my expression seemed to deter her, and she halted, struck by something, and simply stared. "Hello, Liz?" I bypassed her to hang up my coat in the closet. "Are the girls home?" "They're upstairs on their computers," she replied as I made my way into the kitchen. Dinner bubbled on the stove, and the table was set. I fetched myself a beer and settled at the counter. "Did Peter Danielson get in touch with you?" she inquired, her tone tinged with unease. Yeah, he paid me a visit earlier, I confirmed. A pause ensued. Liz stirred the pasta on the stove, evidently anticipating further elaboration from me. Sweetheart, I hope he managed to reassure you. About Bernardo, I mean. There's absolutely nothing between us. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, she expressed remorsefully. Yeah, I heard his version, I responded calmly. As for reassurance, let's just say I'm reserving judgment. Her expression shifted to one of shock. I don't understand. Didn't he explain about the harassment and the sensitive nature of the case? Yes, I replied evenly. Quite a convincing narrative. It might prove to be true, I suppose, but I'll reserve my judgment until it's all confirmed. Liz opened her mouth, then closed it. It was evident she was taken aback by my skepticism, but frankly, I couldn't care less. After a prolonged silence, she spoke up. Are you planning to come back home? I've returned, at least for the moment. My suitcase is in the trunk. I'll retrieve it later once the girls are asleep. How are they holding up, by the way? What do they think is happening? I told them you were engrossed in a major project and would be working late at the office for several nights. But I doubt they bought it. I just didn't want to delve into it, not until we had a chance to talk. She turned to me pleadingly, tears evident on her cheeks. Alan, please. I know we need to have a serious conversation about Richard Groner and everything else. I'm deeply sorry. I had no idea you knew anything about it. I'm so ashamed. She paused, tears streaming down her face before continuing. But I want you to know, I never did anything with Tom Bernardo or any other man. I swear it. I glanced at her, non-committal. I wasn't entirely convinced. Dinner was awkward, yet oddly entertaining. The girls were thrilled to see me, bursting with curiosity about what was happening. But being teenagers, they didn't express their emotions directly. They teased me mercilessly. I looked old. My tie was atrocious. Why didn't I exercise more? And I relished it, realizing it was their way of reconnecting with me. Their lively spirits also provided a cover for the fact that I had little to say to Liz. I could easily ignore her without the girls noticing, as they were engrossed in their own chatter and teasing. After dinner, I spent time with each of my daughters, catching up on their school and social lives, relishing the joy of having them. Once they retired to their rooms, I unpacked my suitcase, got undressed, and went straight to bed without acknowledging Liz, who was in the bathroom brushing her hair in her nightgown. She watched me cautiously, and as I was about to switch off the light, she spoke up. Alan, can we talk? I don't think there's anything to discuss, I replied, turning away from her. But darling, when I see Tom Bernardo's face in the newspaper and read about his arrest, then I'll be ready to talk. For now I'm back, because I missed the girls. With that, I turned off the light. Just before sleep took over, I heard her softly crying. Over the next day, Friday, and throughout the weekend and into the following Monday, I made a concerted effort to maintain my usual demeanor around Carly and Christina. I believe I managed quite well, although it was likely evident to them the tension between Liz and me. With Liz, my feelings of anger and suspicion simmered beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. I remained distant and aloof, offering only terse responses to her inquiries, and my body language made it clear that I preferred to keep my distance. Despite the evident distress on her face, rather than evoking sympathy, it only served to stoke my anger. You brought this upon yourself, I thought bitterly. You've earned every bit of distrust from your husband. On Tuesday morning, as I stood in the kitchen in my bathrobe preparing coffee, Liz entered from the front porch, holding the Cincinnati Enquirer in her hand. Wordlessly, she handed it to me, positioning the front page so I could see the headline, Medical Center Administrator Arrested. There, in stark black and white, was a photo of Bernardo, clearly a stock image. I accepted the paper and read the article meticulously. Allegations of harassment and assault, 4 alleged victims and 9 charges brought against him. He had been suspended from his position at the hospital and had enlisted the services of Granado and Greevy, a prestigious law firm in Cincinnati, for his defense. Professing his innocence, he dismissed the accusations as mere misunderstandings. Anonymous quotes from his colleagues at the hospital expressed shock and disbelief. He had always seemed like such a nice person, they said. Nobody could have foreseen this turn of events. I set the paper aside and turned to Liz, who watched me with anticipation. "It seems to be true," I began slowly. "That guy sounds despicable. Could you fill me in on who the victims were and how they're coping?" Unexpectedly, Liz's expression fell, and tears started to flow. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. Despite my initial anger, a wave of compassion washed over me. I moved to sit beside her, embracing her gently as she cried loudly for several minutes, her head resting on my shoulder. Eventually, she regained some composure and looked up at me, tears streaking her face. "I was so scared you'd never speak to me again. I just didn't know what to do." After blowing her nose and wiping her eyes, she sat upright, meeting my gaze solemnly. "Alan, I had no involvement with Bernardo, none at all. I swear it, except for supporting Alexa, Diane, and the others when he harassed them. They've been struggling, especially Diane. That's what all those meetings were about, why I've been so preoccupied." "I understand. I wish you'd confided in me, but I know Danielson asked you not to." There was a pause, and the tender moment dissipated, leaving tension in the air. "But there's the other, my affair," she murmured, unable to maintain eye contact and instead staring down at the table. "Alan, I'm deeply sorry. I feel ashamed. I had no clue you were aware, and when it came to an end, it was like, within days, I began to wake up again. It felt like I had been in some sort of dream. I was filled with horror at what I had done, furious with myself, just enraged. And then I realized I was the luckiest woman alive. I had committed this dreadful, unforgivable act. But it was over, and you were unaware, and I still had my marriage and my children. It was like crashing my car terribly due to recklessness and walking away without a scratch. So I came to understand that there was only one thing." Liz was interrupted by the sound of the girls thundering down the stairs into the kitchen, late for the school bus as usual. For a few minutes, the room buzzed with excitement and laughter as they grabbed a muffin and a glass of juice, yelled their after-school plans to us, gave us each a hug and a kiss, and dashed out the door. Once they were gone, we exchanged grins, the room still echoing with their noise and vitality. "We're so fortunate," I remarked. They're amazing girls, Claudia, she said. "And it's not all just luck. We've been pretty good parents all these years." We shared a smile for a moment longer, and Liz took my hand in hers. But then she leaned in and asked, "Alan, how did you find out about my affair? And why didn't you confront me?" "No," I snapped. I was instantly enraged, as if a switch had been flipped. All the warmth and intimacy of that morning had evaporated. I withdrew my hand and rose from the table. "We managed perfectly well for 8 years without discussing it, and I have no intention of discussing it now. But, darling, What aspect of no are you struggling to comprehend, Liz? I need to get ready for work." Without glancing back, I stormed up the stairs to shave and get dressed. Overcoming Richard Groner? The next 3 weeks were filled with suffering. Both Liz and I, and probably the girls, also felt growing bewilderment when we showered them with love, but hardly exchanged a few words with each other. Liz's sadness and pleading were obvious towards me, while I remained detached. I found that I was powerless to change. When I was apart from Liz, whether at work or at the gym, I could keep my composure. Her single indiscretion happened many years ago. Then I endured, coped, and somehow kept myself in check, waiting for her return. And she came back. She loved me, and I knew it. For many years we were happy again. And yet, when I met her, especially when she was looking for intimacy, I was seized with a surge of rage. Vivid images that I had been suppressing for a long time came flooding back to me. I found that I could not communicate with her politely, except for the usual conversations about work, household chores, or children. Any attempt on her part to touch on the topic of our romance or our emotions caused an inevitable explosion, prompting me to either pull away from her or abruptly leave the room. I found myself returning to indulging in lengthy showers again, no longer shedding tears as much as seething with rage, cursing her quietly under my breath, and dwelling on intricate revenge scenarios. Ideas like packing up the kids and disappearing, leaving her with nothing, and ensuring she never saw any of us again crossed my mind. As for intimacy, it was a joke. The mere thought of being intimate with Liz ignited a storm of anger and jealousy within me. The very idea infuriated me. She could sense my reluctance to engage with her. It was evident. So, on a few occasions as we prepared for bed, she tentatively reached for my arm and caressed it, a familiar, silent gesture with a clear implication. In our happier times, I have always welcomed her expressions of close interest. I appreciated not always having to initiate, knowing she desired me too. But now, I simply muttered, "No, Liz," without even facing her. She withdrew her hand and lay beside me in silence. A few nights following one of these refusals, she lay waiting for me in bed. As I emerged from the bathroom, she began to speak before I could settle in beside her and switch off the light. "Alan, I love you and miss you, and I want to be intimate. Can we, please?" I was taken aback. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I pondered for a moment. "No," I replied eventually. "I don't want to. The thought of being intimate with you only conjures images of you and him in my mind. It angers me, and I have no desire to even touch you." "But Alan," Liz sobbed, "that was years ago. We've been happy together since then. Please, can't I make it right?" I simply shook my head, avoiding her gaze, and listened as she cried softly. After a few minutes, she got up, retrieved her bathrobe from the closet, and left the room. Climbing into bed, to my surprise, I fell asleep quickly. The next day, around 6:30, I entered a silent house to find Liz waiting for me at the kitchen table. She appeared weary and sorrowful, her expression tired, and the bags beneath her eyes more pronounced than I recalled. "Carly and Christina went to eat at the Chinese garden. I need to have a private conversation with you, Alan." "Sure." I settled into a seat across from her. "I'm at a loss," she murmured. "I love you and I'm sorry, but I don't know how to fix things or how to connect with you anymore. When I did that awful thing, when I got involved with Groner, you must have been furious, yet you never voiced it. Now, 8 years later, it feels like I've lost you. I just don't know what to do." I had no response, so I simply shrugged. "Alan, can we seek counseling? I can ask Sarah at the hospital for a recommendation without revealing who it's for. She knows all the best professionals. She's been in her position for years." I had considered this option myself. "Okay, but it needs to be a male counselor, all right? I want someone who might grasp how I'm feeling, given my circumstances." "That's fine by me, darling," she said, visibly relieved. "I'll talk to her tomorrow." She reached for my hand, and I allowed her to hold it. "Thank you." Sebastian McElroney exuded a cheerful demeanor despite being in his 50s and carrying extra weight, resembling more of a beach ball than merely chubby. His complexion was ruddy, and his large jowls shook with laughter or chuckles. Yet, within moments of meeting him, I sensed his intelligence and astuteness in his attentive gaze and careful listening. It was evident he absorbed everything. After the customary small talk, he inquired about our presence, and Liz spoke first. I had an affair 8 years ago. I believe my husband was unaware, and since then our marriage has been wonderful. We've both been happy. Then a few months ago, he accused me of having another affair, which I wasn't. And he revealed he knew about the first one, the only one from 8 years ago. Since then, Alan has been distant and angry. He refuses to discuss his feelings, rejects my attempts to apologize or explain or share my emotions. He completely distanced himself from me, including in a close way. I love him, miss him terribly, and I'm overwhelmed with guilt. I don't know what to do. Liz leaned back, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Alan, Sebastian asked, is that your perspective? More or less. I was able to control my anger back then. I devised a plan to address Liz's affair, and I stuck to it, and it turned out okay. But now, ever since I confronted her about her relationship with Richard Groner, that's the guy's name, all the old anger has resurfaced. I just can't manage it, and I find myself angry at Liz constantly. Got it, he replied after a pause. Liz, could you share with me about the affair? How and why you think it happened? We don't need the specific details. And Alan, I'll request you not to intervene until she finishes. Then you'll have your turn. Liz provided the context. The challenging year of Carly's leukemia, our exhaustion and desperation, followed by the incredible relief of her recovery. How Liz and I struggled to balance work and life and drifted apart a bit. All of this sounded familiar, and she recounted the story much like I would have. However, the seduction narrative was new to me, naturally. Groner had been very charming. He took his time, became her confidant, listened to her struggles with Carly's illness, the strain it put on our family, how she and I grew distant. He subtly positioned himself between Liz and me, making her feel understood and supported, unlike her emotionally distant husband. How long did it last? Sebastian gently inquired. The physical aspect didn't begin for quite some time, but I'd say about 6 weeks or so, I suppose. We first, made contact. She turned to me and apologized. I'm sorry, Alan. He initiated contact with me sometime in September. And then, well, it concluded towards the end of October. What led to its end? Prompted Sebastian. He ended it. Just called me in the middle of a workday and said, "Hey, it's been great, you've been fun, but it's over." He was ruthless. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. And then, over the next few days, I felt like the biggest fool in the world. She glanced at me. It took a few days before I started to recover and realize just how foolish I'd been, and how fortunate I was to still have a husband. It was like recuperating from a severe illness, slowly, gradually feeling better, feeling more like yourself, you know. And then I began to regain my senses and see that Alan and the girls had been there all along, patiently waiting for me, even though they were unaware of anything, or so I thought. She abruptly stopped speaking and shrugged her shoulders. Could you elaborate a bit more on your emotions, both during the affair and after it ended? Sebastian's tone was gentle, his demeanor serious, yet inviting. While it was happening, I felt almost like I was under a spell. It was as if I inhabited 2 different personas, or existed in 2 separate worlds. When I was with Richard, he was adept. In terms of intimacy, I mean. Initially, it was quite thrilling, the excitement of being with someone new. So when we were together, she glanced at me, gauging my reaction. I sat motionless, my expression vacant. I felt hollow. Continue, Sebastian prompted. Throughout the seduction. She winced before continuing. I was carried away, I suppose. I constantly fantasized about being with him, replaying our encounters in my mind. Somehow he had managed to position himself as my lover, as if he understood me completely, serving as my confidant, almost like a savior. She turned to me. I would never have a physical relationship with him solely for the sake of intimacy, Alan. not with him or anyone else. It wasn't just about the physical aspect for me, although later on I realized that's all it was for him. Our first meetings were tender and affectionate, akin to the intimacy that lovers share. However, this quickly turned into something completely different: simple physical satisfaction. I didn't understand it at the time, but on reflection, I realized that in his perception, I was just an object for his pleasure, something like a girl of easy virtue that he didn't have to pay for. She looked down at the floor. I was naive. We waited for her to continue. Being away from him, I was numb. I was overcome by dissatisfaction and distraction. I couldn't understand why I betrayed Alan. I still had love for him and was fully aware that I was committing a crime. But it seemed to me that there was a barrier between me and my emotions, as if I was under anesthesia. I knew it was immoral, but I remained emotionally detached. And when he asked me about my problems or expressed concern that we were moving away from each other, I just avoided talking about it. I made up excuses about fatigue or work commitments. I suppressed any thoughts about my relationship with Richard or the possible consequences. There was another moment of silence. I noticed that I had my arms tightly crossed over my chest and was trembling slightly. "What happened next?" Sebastian inquired. "Well, as I mentioned, it felt like emerging from a fever, like a fog lifting. Within a few weeks, I started to regain my senses. What overwhelmed me the most was a sense of shame. I loved Alan. I wasn't the type of woman to betray her husband, jeopardizing my happy marriage and the well-being of my children for some illicit affair. But as time passed, I also felt fortunate. Despite committing this terrible act, I hadn't destroyed my marriage and my life. Each day I grew more grateful and more determined to make it up to Alan. I just wanted to love him, make love to him, and be the wife he deserved. He had been so patient and kind to me. So I found myself again, I suppose. I prioritized time for Alan and me. We became more intimate. I sought ways to demonstrate my love for him. We were content, I believed. I still believe that. We've been content. For 8 years now. I felt happy and incredibly fortunate. Until a couple of months ago. Twice a week, we visited Sebastian's office and settled into our usual spots, me on the left to share our experiences. During my sessions, I steered clear of discussing Carly's illness, focusing instead on Liz's growing detachment and occasional avoidance. I recounted the unsettling incident when Liz feigned ignorance about Richard Groner, which deeply unsettled me. Eventually, I decided to hire a private investigator, I revealed. He provided me with the evidence I sought: photos and audio recordings. Liz audibly gasped, her expression one of horror. "I never actually listened to the tapes or looked at the photos," I confessed. "I knew I couldn't bear it. I sensed it would be too much to handle." Turning back to Sebastian, I continued. Just the thought of it was overwhelming. The rage consumed me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I found solace in long showers, weeping against the wall. Sometimes I'd entertain dark fantasies of harming them both, perhaps violently confronting them, or publicly exposing Liz's betrayal. The images haunted me. Beside me, Liz appeared pale and shaken. With empathy, Sebastian remarked, "It sounds like an incredibly trying period for you. Yet, despite everything, you refrained from confronting her or seeking a divorce. Did you ever consider it?" I chuckled. Of course. I even thought about taking the kids and disappearing, starting over in another state. But I went through a divorce myself. My parents separated when I was 10, and it was a real nightmare. Terrifying. They were both so consumed with anger that they could no longer focus on being parents to me and my siblings. They behaved like children themselves, leaving us in the crossfire. And then my brother got divorced many years ago, and I saw his children going through the same ordeal. I just couldn't put Carly and Christina through that kind of ordeal. How could I? Especially after everything Carly's been through. So I decided to do everything in my power to save the marriage. But you could have met Liz face to face, told her you knew about their affair and demanded that she stop it, he suggested. I didn't think it would solve anything. I wasn't sure I could control my anger. I imagined her feeling guilty for weeks, months, trying to make amends, while I fumed, unable to even speak to her. I grinned ironically. It's very similar to where we are right now. Besides, I continued, I knew I couldn't believe a word she said. If she says she loves me, or tries to get close to me, how can I trust her? How was I supposed to know if she really wanted me, or if she just hoped I wouldn't kick her out? I knew I had to see how she would behave after this affair. I had to make sure that on her own she still loves me and wants to be with me. So I pretended. I behaved like a loving husband and kept my anger and sadness locked inside. Except when I was alone in the shower. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, took care of the kids, and even sometimes was close to Liz, although I wouldn't call it love. Liz was sitting quietly next to me, looking pale and devastated. So, your intention was to endure it, to tolerate it until Liz's affair concluded. Time for honesty. Was I going to be truthful? No, I admitted. I went to Groner, showed him a photo, and threatened him. I compelled him to call Liz and terminate it. I was present when he made the call. "Oh my God," Liz whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Here's what I think," Sebastian began. We'd been meeting with him for 3 weeks. Firstly, Richard Groner was undoubtedly an experienced and adept seducer. He knew the ropes and had likely done this before. He was patient and subtle in breaking down Liz's defenses. I didn't detect any indication in her story that she was actively seeking to cheat on her husband. I began to interject, but he raised a hand to stop me. That doesn't excuse Liz, Alan. Adultery is still adultery. However, for both of you to move forward, it's crucial to understand the full context. He sought intimacy from her, but first befriended her and gained her trust to begin the intimate aspect of their relationship. Now, on to your side. Alan, you did something incredibly brave. Despite your own pain, you prioritized your children's needs above all. While your approach may not have been optimal, it felt right to you at the time. And from what I gather, it seems to have been effective. You both mentioned that the last few years of your marriage were quite positive. Yet, Alan, your strategy inadvertently shifted the power dynamic in your favor, perhaps without you realizing it. A significant part of the pain from being cheated on is the revelation that someone you love and trust has kept such a significant secret. By taking the action you did, you essentially turned the tables on Liz. You knew about the affair while she remained unaware that you were aware. I nodded. I had sensed something along those lines, though not as clearly as Sebastian had just articulated. He stated, I believe that during the immensely painful period of her affair and its aftermath, a part of what kept you going was the sense of control you had over her, your own hidden knowledge. He leaned in slightly. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Instead of the affair tearing your family apart, you found a way to preserve your marriage. It was courageous, and rather astute, actually. But neither of you has informed me about what transpired 2 months ago. What prompted the change? Alan, why did you disclose your secret to Liz after all these years? I recounted the situation involving Tom K. Bernardo, the weeks of Liz's distance and distraction, and my growing concern that she might be cheating on me again. Still, I wouldn't have spoken up, I confessed. But one morning I voiced my frustration to her about her supposed late meetings, and we ended up arguing. She said something, and I just snapped, in an instant. I shook my head. 8 years of holding back, and it all crumbled in a single moment. Sebastian asked softly. What did she say? When have I ever given you a reason not to trust me? The room fell into a heavy silence. I could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning through the vents. Then Liz spoke up. I remember that now. I had forgotten the exact words. But when I said them, in that split second before you responded, I realized what I had said, and I felt ashamed. I couldn't control myself, I admitted. I confronted her with it with Groner, and warned her that if she was repeating it with Bernardo, our marriage was finished. Then I just left. I shrugged. That's pretty much the whole story. At 4:08 on a Tuesday afternoon, I lifted my head as my office door swung open, surprised to find Carly and Christina entering, carrying their book bags. Hey, Dad, do you have a moment for a chat? Carly asked. Of course, sweetie. Please come in and take a seat. I greeted them with kisses, and they settled into my office chairs. What brings you two down here? I inquired cheerfully. Their visits to my office were rare. My work didn't typically capture their interest. After sharing a glance, Christina rose and closed the door. Carly spoke softly. What's happening between you and Mom? What do you mean? I replied, puzzled. Carly gave me an incredulous look. Come on, Dad. We're not kids anymore. It's been almost 2 months. You both act fine around us, but you barely speak to each other. You seem angry, and Mom is just sad. Sometimes at night we hear her crying downstairs in the living room. It's pretty obvious, don't you think? Is Dad and Mom getting a divorce? Christina asked, breaking the silence. They both stared at me, their expressions grave. No, we're not, I replied almost immediately. It was a falsehood. I had no certainty about our marital status. But admitting the truth, maybe, would only heighten their worry. If divorce was on the horizon, they would have to confront it soon enough. No need to distress them further at the moment. Then why are things so tense, Dad? What's happening? Carly inquired, displaying an impressive grasp of analogy, likely influenced by her study of 20th century European history. Sometimes marriages hit rough patches, Carly, and this is a particularly rough one for your mom and me, I won't deny that. But we're addressing it, and we'll continue to work on it until we've resolved things. But why are you so angry and she's always crying? Sweetheart. Girls. I'm not going to discuss the specifics with you. Those are matters between your mom and me. I rose from my seat, stepping around my desk to crouch between their chairs, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. I regret that Mom and I aren't getting along well lately, and I'm even more sorry that it's causing you concern. But you need to trust us a bit. We both love you deeply, and I paused. I was about to say, and we'll both support you, whatever happens. But that wasn't the right message. And we're committed to resolving our issues, Mom and I. You might have to be patient with us for a while. Christina said, Dad, just tell us what's going on. We know you love Mom, so it must be something significant for you to be this upset for so long. I smiled and stood up slowly. My knees were hurting. Sorry, Chris, no details. I put my arm around her and pulled her into a hug. But I'll take you both to Starbucks across the street and get you one of those huge mocha latte frappuccinos you love. Then I'll leave work early and we can drive home together, so you won't have to wait for the downtown bus. I quickly saved my work files, grabbed my briefcase, and happily led my daughters out of the office. All the while hoping I'd reassured them and wondering if anything I'd said was true. Week 5 with Sebastian. Liz, what are your desires? What do you aim to achieve through our sessions together? I simply want Alan back, she stated. I want to restore our marriage, the joyful, affectionate union we shared in the beginning, and then once more, for nearly 8 years. She glanced at me. But I'm completely clueless about how to reach that point, or even how to connect with you, Alan, or what your expectations are from me. And you, Alan. Sebastian fixed his gaze on me. I'm not sure. In theory, it's simple. I want to move beyond all this turmoil, reconcile with Liz, and find happiness again. But in reality, Sebastian, it's not happening, and I'm unsure how to facilitate it. I'm filled with anger and pain, feeling betrayed and furious, and there's no improvement. He pondered for a moment. If you could forgive her back then, when the wounds were fresh, why not now? After all, Alan, you've attained what you desired. As you previously mentioned, she's returned to you, proving repeatedly her love and dedication to you. And Liz, you haven't strayed again, have you? Absolutely not. I haven't even glanced at another man since... Richard. Her tone was resolute as she looked directly at Sebastian, then at me. I believed her. I sighed. I'm uncertain, Sebastian. I've certainly contemplated it extensively, and everything you're saying is valid. However, because of the issue with Tom Bernardo, I found myself reliving it all over again. I thought it was safely in the past, but then all that pain came crashing down on me once more, like experiencing torture and then having to endure it again years later. There was a moment of silence before I spoke again. I once read a memoir by a man who had been tortured multiple times. He was a former CIA spy. The first time lasted 6 days, and he never gave in, never disclosed anything. He had been trained to resist torture, and despite the intense pain, he managed it. But about 4 years later, he was captured and tortured again. This time, he didn't last more than about 2 hours before revealing secrets. He explained that having experienced it once and knowing what was to come, he couldn't face it, couldn't endure it a second time. I suppose it just feels somewhat like that to me. The second time, with Bernardo, when I thought she was cheating again, I just couldn't hold it together, having to go through it all over again. It sounded melodramatic, but that's truly how it felt to me in that moment. Does Liz need to make it up to you somehow? Are you waiting for an apology she hasn't given yet, or for some form of atonement? Does she deserve more punishment than she's received? No, I know she's suffering. Sometimes I even feel sorry for her and want to comfort her. But then I become so angry. She did this to us. She's the one who betrayed our trust. Why is it my responsibility to make her feel better? Liz sat beside me, her eyes dry, but her expression very sad. She kept her head down, not even glancing at me. All right, let's set her aside for a moment, Alan. What about you? He shifted forward in his chair. When you envision your life a year from now, what do you see? Are you and Liz still together? Are things going well? Or are you separated? That's an easy one. I see her with me, with the kids. All of us united and content, pretty much how things have been for a while now. Until recently. And is that what you desire? Is that the outcome you hope for? I nodded slowly. Then I'll ask you again. What needs to occur? What does Liz need to do? What do you need to do? I shook my head, feeling utterly despondent. I have no clue whatsoever. Early on Saturday morning, I found myself standing under the steady stream of water in the shower once again. Though I had risen to prepare coffee, the appetite for breakfast eluded me. Liz remained in bed, and I knew the girls would remain asleep for several more hours. This morning my emotions weren't edged with anger, but rather clouded with sadness and confusion. As the water cascaded over me, my mind was a blank canvas. Suddenly a rush of cool air swept in as the shower door creaked open and shut behind me. I pivoted to see Liz standing there, unclothed, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to me. Liz, please, Alan. I instinctively extended my hands to ward her off, but she disregarded them, enveloping me in a tight embrace. She clung to me desperately, unwilling to let go. She wept uncontrollably, her words barely audible as she repeated them into my ear. Take me back. Please take me back. she pleaded, her breaths ragged between sobs, clinging to me as though her life depended on it. Her body trembled with cold, and without hesitation, I guided us both beneath the warmth of the shower, returning her embrace, soothing her with gentle strokes along her back, whispering reassurances into her hair. We rocked slowly together. Her trembling and tears gradually subsided. The whispers subsided. I hugged her to me. When she seemed to calm down, I pulled back slightly to smile at her, meeting her uncertain gaze before kissing her. Her response was passionate. We kissed. When I pulled away again, smiling, she burst into tears again, clinging to me even tighter than before. Turning off the water, I led us out of the shower. Then I carried her back to bed, lay down next to her, and we got down to business. After that, we lay down, and when Liz started talking, I silenced her by putting my finger to her lips. "Tonight," I said. "That's right. And every day. For as long as we can." She nodded eagerly, and a wide smile appeared on her face. Soon we fell asleep in each other's arms. "Sebastian." I left a message on his answering machine. "This is Alan Hendricks, Sunday evening. Liz and I are going to cancel our meetings this week. Most likely we will reschedule the meeting, but the timing is still unknown. I'll contact you when we're ready to schedule again. Thank you." The previous evening had been eventful. After a quick pizza dinner, Carly and Christina went to the cinema, and Liz and I, without exchanging a word, retired to the bedroom. It was the most amazing night of our honeymoon. Liz fell asleep quickly, and I went to clean up and managed not to fall asleep until the girls returned home. And strangely enough, that's exactly how we decided everything. The next evening passed in the same atmosphere. The girls were in their rooms, and Liz and I had a pleasant night. The next night, Liz teased me playfully at dinner. Later, in our room, we continued our games. For the next 11 days, we were intimate at least once a day. About the 5th day, and when we were lying in bed after intimacy, Liz looked up at me and started talking about this topic. "Darling, maybe we should talk about what happened, about my affair." I smiled and shook my head. "Sebastian is fine, but I don't feel the need to discuss this further. Perhaps in the future. But this, Liz, seems right to me. A reunion like this, without words." She smiled, nodded, then kissed me and snuggled up to me, closing her eyes. One Saturday, I picked up Christina and a couple of her friends from the mall. Carly, who had a driver's license, was somewhere with Andy, her current boyfriend. After we dropped off Christina's friends and headed home, she noticed, "It looks like you and Mom have established a relationship." I chuckled. "Have you noticed an improvement?" She rolled her eyes. "Seriously, Dad? You two are so touching. You look at each other so lovingly during dinner, as if you were saying, 'Come on, rent a room.'" We laughed. "Well, we do have a room," I joked. She grinned. "So things have gone better?" "Marriage takes effort, Chris. There are difficult moments, but it seems that your mother and I are coping with them." With feigned gratitude, she joked, "Thank you for your wisdom, O Lord of Life. I will definitely write this down in my book of wise sayings." We laughed again, but I felt her relief. The last time we visited Sebastian, he was surprised and impressed. It happened about 6 weeks later. "Well, something is definitely going well. Do you want to share it?" I just smiled. Liz blushed slightly and said, "We are. We were often close, almost every day for several weeks, and still at least 4 to 5 times a week. God, it's like we're newlyweds again. Alan, it was wonderful. With love and pleasure. For some reason, it seems that the tension has subsided and we are just enjoying each other." He turned to me and noticed, "I see a change in both of you. Liz is just beaming and you look more relaxed. In fact, you've become younger. It's like a weight has been lifted from your shoulders." I shrugged my shoulders. The last time we were here, you asked what needs to be done to improve the relationship between Liz and me. I had no idea at the time. It turns out that it wasn't about the words. Maybe there were too many words, too many reflections, and I don't know, not enough physical intimacy. I'm sorry, Sebastian. He smiled. I'm familiar with the term. Then he asked, so everything is fine now? Is there no need to go back to our previous approach? Liz and I exchanged glances. She shook her head and said, I don't think so. It just seems to me that we're good with each other right now. She took my hand and I squeezed it gently. We know we can always come back, I said. But there's no need for that right now. When we left, he shook my hand tightly and Liz kissed me on the cheek. Good luck, he said. I have a good feeling about this. Thank you, I replied. I think I am too.